why Libya turned on Gaddafi, and how his final moments really unfolded. For more than 4 decades, Muammar Gaddafi ruled Libya with a mix of fear, ambition, and absolute control. But in 2011, the world watched as that power collapsed faster than anyone expected. His downfall was chaotic, violent, and shocking, even for a leader who had survived coups, sanctions, and war. Today, we are going deep into the events that led to the brutal final hours of Gaddafi's life, from the uprising that swept across Libya to the desperate escape attempt that ended in a dusty drainage pipe on the outskirts of Sirte. This is a story of a ruler who went from commanding an entire nation to running for his life, surrounded, injured, and moments away from a fate he could no longer control. If you want more historical breakdowns like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. By 2011, Muammar Gaddafi was a ruler out of time. For more than 4 decades, he had stood at the center of Libya's political universe, a man who saw himself as leader of the revolution, father of the nation, and voice of Africa. He had outlived coups, Western airstrikes, diplomatic isolation, and sanctions. But in his final months, the country he claimed to have liberated disintegrated around him. The end would not come in a court or a palace, but on a devastated roadside in his own hometown, with cameras rolling and rage exploding all at once. The chain of events that led to his last hours began with protests far from the luxury of Tripoli's compounds. In February 2011, families of prisoners killed in the 1996 Abu Salim massacre gathered in Benghazi to demand answers. Their small demonstration collided with a wider wave of anger sweeping across North Africa and the Middle East. Tunisia's leader had already fallen, Egypt's was on the brink, and Libyans who had spent their lives under Gaddafi's tight control seized the moment. Crowds grew by the day. In Benghazi and other eastern cities, people chanted against corruption, repression, and the absence of basic freedoms. Gaddafi's security forces responded the way they always had, with bullets and fear. Snipers fired into crowds. Hospitals reported head and chest wounds consistent with live ammunition. Instead of crushing dissent, the violence turned protests into an uprising. Police stations were torched, army bases overrun, and defecting soldiers joined the people they had once been ordered to police. Within weeks, much of eastern Libya had slipped from Gaddafi's grip. In response, the opposition formed the National Transitional Council, claiming to represent a new Libya. Gaddafi answered with televised rants, insisting that the protesters were rats and foreign agents, promising to cleanse the country house by house. His son Saif al-Islam warned that Libya would drown in blood if the rebellion continued. Rather than intimidate the opposition, those threats hardened resolve. By March, Libya was at war with itself. Gaddafi's remaining loyal units, including elite brigades led by his sons, used tanks, artillery, and aircraft to push back toward rebel territories. The city of Benghazi faced the real risk of a decisive assault. Images of shelled neighborhoods and injured civilians spread quickly. Fearing a mass killing, the Arab League called for a no-fly zone, and the United Nations soon passed a resolution authorizing all necessary measures to protect civilians. Western and Arab states launched an air campaign aimed at disabling Gaddafi's war machine. NATO took command of the operation, striking air bases, armored columns, and communication hubs. At sea, warships enforced an arms embargo. Over time, Gaddafi's forces found themselves overstretched and undersupplied. Rebel units from Misrata, the Western Mountains, and the east pushed steadily toward the capital. In August 2011, they launched their final offensive on Tripoli, known as Operation Mermaid Dawn. Fighters who had secretly organized inside the city rose up as convoys of rebels advanced from the outskirts. After days of heavy fighting, Gaddafi's fortified compound at Bab al-Azizia fell. Once a symbol of his untouchable power, it was quickly stripped of weapons, documents, and luxuries. But as rebels poured through its tunnels and courtyards, Gaddafi himself was nowhere to be found. While his family scattered, some fleeing to Algeria, others to Niger, Gaddafi made a different choice. Rather than leave Libya, he moved towards Sirte, the coastal city where he had been born and which he had transformed into a showcase for his rule. Sirte had wide avenues, government complexes, and modern buildings funded with oil money. It also sat at the heart of tribal networks that had long been loyal to him. If there was any place left where he could hold out, it was here. By early September, Gaddafi had taken refuge in Sirte with a shrinking circle of loyalists. Bodyguards, tribal fighters, close advisors, and key figures like his son Mutassim and Defense Minister Abu Bakr Yunus Jabber. The siege that followed was grinding and destructive. Loyalist forces used apartment blocks, schools, and public buildings as firing positions. Streets were rigged with mines and improvised explosives. Grad rockets, mortars, and tank shells pounded neighborhoods day after day. Infrastructure collapsed. Electricity and water failed. Those civilians who could escape fled. Those who could not were trapped in basements and shattered homes. Gaddafi's small group moved constantly, sleeping in different houses and underground shelters to avoid detection. Still, he refused to surrender. He spoke of breaking out of the siege, heading south to Saba, and perhaps onward across the border. He did not intend to appear in chains before a court, but every route was watched. Every road out of Sirte was dangerous. By mid-October, it was obvious that time was running out. Rebel fighters controlled most of the city. Loyalist strongholds had shrunk to a few blocks. On the evening of October 19th, Gaddafi and the last members of his inner circle made a final decision. They would try to escape before dawn. They assembled a large convoy, dozens of vehicles including pickup trucks with mounted weapons, SUVs packed with fighters and aides, and trucks carrying ammunition. Mutassim, Abu Bakr Yunus Jabir, Security Chief Mansour Dao, and a handful of family members joined the attempt. Just after dark, the convoy began to move, creeping through damaged streets without headlights, using buildings and trees as cover. What they did not know was that the sky above Sirte was being watched. NATO drones and surveillance aircraft had monitored the area for weeks, looking for any sign that Gaddafi was trying to flee. As the convoy edged out toward the western outskirts of the city on the morning of October 20th, it was spotted. Around 8:30 a.m., a U.S. Predator drone fired a missile at one of the lead vehicles, stopping the front of the column. Moments later, French jets struck the rear of the convoy with precision-guided bombs. Vehicles exploded, flipped, or swerved off the road. Dozens of loyalist fighters were killed where they sat. Survivors staggered out, some bleeding, some on fire, abandoning twisted metal and burning trucks. Those who could still move ran for cover. Some ducked into nearby buildings and rubble. Gaddafi, Mutassim, and a small group headed toward a large concrete drainage pipe just off the road. It was about the height of a crouching man, partially hidden by brush and debris. They crawled inside, hoping the dark, cramped tunnel would shield them from view. Rebel fighters from Misrata, who had been fighting in Sirte for weeks, quickly converged on the site of the airstrike. They moved from wrecked vehicle to wrecked vehicle, searching the area, following trails of blood and footprints. Eventually, they noticed the pipe. A grenade was tossed inside. Then, weapons ready, they stepped closer. In the dim interior, they saw the figures hiding. Gaddafi was there, blood on his face, clothes dirty and torn, injuries to his arm, leg, and back. He was pulled out into daylight, struggling to stand. Mutassim and other loyalists were seized nearby. What happened next was chaotic, filmed on phones and shouted over by dozens of voices. Dragged to a roadside and then into the back of a pickup truck, Gaddafi was surrounded by fighters who had seen their city shelled and their neighbors killed. They hit him, pushed him, and shouted about decades of rule and months of war. Sometime during that violent ride, Muammar Gaddafi was fatally wounded, shot in the head and abdomen. By the time the truck reached Misrata's control, he was dead. His body was laid out in a cold storage room, displayed to long lines of Libyans who wanted to see with their own eyes that the era was over. Days later, in a secret desert grave, he was buried in an unknown spot. A ruler who had once dreamed of uniting continents and defying superpowers spent his final hours running from airstrikes, hiding in a drainage pipe, and dying in the back of a pickup truck. Brought down not by distant governments, but by the people who had lived under his rule.